it's great to be here and talk to you and about the very hot issues that are before the courts and the law relating to privacy and related matters. But I thought I would come at it through the route of the Supreme Court. And I'm sure one question on your mind is, who's my favorite Supreme Court justice? Now, this is a somewhat difficult question because I've had a favorite Supreme Court justice for many years, but unfortunately he's gone. That's David Souter. I love David Souter because he was just so weird. I mean, in a group of basically computer professionals, you'll be pleased to know that one of the Supreme Court justices didn't have a computer, didn't have a cell phone, didn't have an answering machine on his dial phone in his house. He lived this sort of 19th century existence. He doesn't like electric light. He moves his chair around his chambers over the course of the day to catch the sunlight. He eats the same thing for lunch every day. He has a cup of yogurt and an apple, including the core, which is disgusting when you think about it. But anyway, Justice Souter, I thought, always had a wonderful perspective on what it meant to be a Supreme Court justice, because the Supreme Court is at once a very public and important institution, but it's also an institution where people don't know much about it. People don't know much about the justices, don't know who they are, don't know what... can I just tell the folks who are running the conference, my little clock isn't running, and I don't, after 2 or 3 hours, you might get tired of me. So there it is. There it's now. It's started out. See, I knew that would get him. Back to Justice Souter. Justice Souter, he had this great perspective because they're famous but largely unknown, and he sometimes would have a little fun with that. And I'll give you an example. Now, for reasons that remain obscure, David Souter and Stephen Breyer are frequently mistaken for each other. Now, if you know what they look like, they really don't look anything alike, but it happens to both of them all the time. And not long ago, Justice Souter, as he often did, was driving from here in Washington to his home in New Hampshire, and he stopped at a little restaurant in Massachusetts to get something to eat. And he's sitting there, and a couple came up to him, and the guy said, "I know you. You're on the Supreme Court, right?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You're Stephen Breyer, right?" And Souter didn't want to embarrass the fellow in front of his wife, so he says, "Yes, I'm Stephen Breyer." And they're chatting for a little while, but then he says, "So, Justice Breyer, I one thing I always wanted to know. It's a question Souter wasn't ready for." He said, so Justice Breyer, what's the best thing about being on the Supreme Court?" He thought for a minute, and he said, "I'd have to say it's the privilege of serving with David Souter." Now, how can you not love a guy like that, right? But he's gone now, and I got to admit. All right, so let's talk about the Supreme Court by the numbers for a minute. All right, you have 6 men and 3 women. First time in history there are 3 women on the Supreme Court. There are 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. There are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. First time in history for that. There are representatives of 4 New York City boroughs on the Supreme Court. You have Sonia Sotomayor from the Bronx, Antonin Scalia from Queens, Ruth Ginsburg from Brooklyn, and Elena Kagan from Manhattan. Tragically, Staten Island is unrepresented on the Supreme Court, but perhaps future appointments will address that. Anyway, those are, I hope, some interesting facts about the Supreme Court, but I don't think they are really terribly important. Here's an important fact about the Supreme Court. There are 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. I'm going to talk for somewhat longer, not 2 or 3 hours, but I'm going to talk for somewhat longer. But you now know most of what you need to know about the United States Supreme Court. There are 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And, we sometimes believe, we sometimes hope that the court is a refuge from the partisan politics that we're so familiar with on the other side of First Street in the Capitol or in the race for the White House. And perhaps at some glorious time in the past, that was true. But it's certainly not true now. The partisan disagreements that roil the country, that prevent people like the really distinguished nominee for Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, who was tragically, I think, rejected by the Senate yesterday. I mean, those sorts of fights, they take place in the Supreme Court just as they take place in Congress. And to see why this moment in the history of the Supreme Court is so important, this closely divided but Republican majority, the last time, it's important to look back at the last time the Supreme Court was not evenly divided. The last time there was a very clear ideological majority on the Supreme Court, and that was in the mid and late 1960s, when, towards the end of Earl Warren's tenure as Chief Justice, when there was a solid liberal majority. There were 7 liberals on the court, and there really was a liberal agenda that the courts, that the Supreme Court was pushing. And year after year, you saw dramatic movements of the law to the left, very, very intentionally. 1964, New York Times against Sullivan. Justice Brennan's famous opinion that changed libel law and gave the press important new protections. 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut. Justice William O. Douglas's famous opinion that created the constitutional right to privacy said that married couples could no longer be forbidden from buying birth control. 1966, Earl Warren's decision in Miranda versus Arizona, the case that revolutionized criminal procedure and perhaps more importantly, changed television dramas forever. It's like the one right everybody knows they have, right? The right to remain silent. 1967, perhaps the best named case in the history of the Supreme Court. Loving versus Virginia. What was the case of Loving about? Loving versus Virginia, of course, it was the case about marriage. It was the case that said that states could no longer ban racial intermarriage. Think about that, 1967. There are people in this room who were alive in 1967, and I think I'm right about that. And yet it wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court got around to saying that racial intermarriage bans were unconstitutional. Of course, a decision that's much in the news today because of a similar fight going on about same-sex marriage. But it is worth remembering that in 1960, when Barack Obama's parents got married in Hawaii, their marriage was a crime in 19 states, and there were people in prison in this country for that crime at that time. So it is worth celebrating, frankly, that the country has come so far that laws like that are not only unconstitutional, but they are literally unthinkable. But, the changes, you never know how change is going to come at the Supreme Court because you never know when justices are going to leave. When Richard Nixon became president in 1969, 4 justices left in quick succession. Jimmy Carter is the only president in American history to serve a full term and just have no appointments to the court because there were no vacancies. But Richard Nixon was only president for 5.5 years. You'll recall he had to leave early. But he got 4 appointments to the Supreme Court. And who left? Earl Warren left, John Harlan left, Hugo Black left, and Abe Fortas all left. And who did Richard Nixon name? He named Warren Burger, Chief Justice, Harry Blackmun, Lewis Powell, and William Rehnquist. And as you think about Richard Nixon's appointments to the Supreme Court, it tells you something about the Supreme Court, but it tells you something even more important. And this is something that I think cannot be overemphasized. And that is the most important political development of our lifetime, which is the evolution of the Republican Party. The Republican Party of the 1970s is unrecognizably different from the Republican Party of today. It was basically a moderate party. It was not a religiously oriented party. It was not a socially conservative party. And when Nixon had all those appointments to the Supreme Court, people thought, oh, the court is going to move dramatically to the right, but it didn't. And the 70s at the Supreme Court were nearly as liberal as the 60s. Think about the big decisions of that period. You had the Nixon tapes case, where they essentially forced Nixon out of office. Pentagon Papers case, they approved school busing. In 1972, they ended the death penalty in the United States, though they let it back in 1976. And still, the most controversial decision of them all, 1973, Roe versus Wade, the case that said states could no longer ban abortion, was a 7-2 opinion. And the only 2 dissenters in Roe v. Wade were William Rehnquist and Byron White, who was appointed by President Kennedy. So 3 of the 4 Republican appointees to the court, Nixon appointees to the court, were in the majority in Roe v. Wade. Simply unthinkable in today's Republican Party. The big change, of course, began in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, who brought with him to Washington someone who is, I think, a very underrated figure in recent American history, and that's Edwin Meese. Edwin Meese, he was an advisor to President Reagan, later the Attorney General, and he said, look, there has been a liberal agenda at the Supreme Court for a long time. We need a conservative agenda. And in appointing lower court judges, in enforcing the law, Edwin Meese really started to bring out this agenda. And so what was that agenda? Expand executive power, end racial preferences intended to assist African Americans, speed up executions, lower the barriers between church and state, and above all, overturn Roe v. Wade and allow states once again to ban abortion. Big part of the Reagan Revolution, as it sometimes calls, with the arrival in Washington of a group of aggressive young conservative lawyers, 2 of whom were John Roberts and Samuel Alito. And I think that is worth remembering about who they were and who they are. But the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan was certainly not the Republican Party of today either. And you saw that in Reagan's appointments to the Supreme Court. During the campaign of 1980, Reagan made a campaign promise that Jimmy Carter didn't even make. Reagan said, if I have the chance, I will appoint the first woman to the Supreme Court. 1981, Potter Stewart unexpectedly announced that he was leaving the court, so Reagan said to his people, look, I made a promise, keep it. Find me a qualified woman for the court. It was not, frankly, that easy in 1981. There were not as many women in prominent positions in the law, especially Republican women. So Reagan's people had to go all the way to the Intermediate Appeals Court in Arizona, not even the highest court in Arizona, to find the remarkable figure who was and is Sandra Day O'Connor. And at the time, it was clear that Justice O'Connor was not a social conservative, was not a hardcore conservative. She was a moderate, as she remained during her entire extremely consequential tenure on the court. And that was fine with Ronald Reagan. And that, again, tells you where the Republican Party was.